Welcome to Slayer the Alchemist, and welcome to another Sabbath Sunday. This is where Darin and I get together with you on Sunday to discuss all things Black Sabbath. Darin and I have a Black Sabbath podcast, Into the Void, a Black Sabbath podcast on all the streaming platforms. So make sure you please check that out. For today's episode, we are giving you our top three favorite, or what in our opinion are the best sounding Black Sabbath records. Now, what we mean by that, we're talking production, sound quality, all of that, what we think is sonically the best sounding Black Sabbath album in our opinion. So we've got three of them for you. We're going to go backwards here from three to one. So Darin, was this an easy task, or did you have to put a lot of thought into this?
No, it was easy for me. I mean, there's just at least three that I Sabbath albums that I just love the way they sound, and so now I made my pick of three pretty quickly.
All
So
right.
starting at number three, this may not be too much of a surprise to people that are regulars to the Lair of the Alchemist Sabbath Sunday, but I've got Technical Ecstasy, actually the Vertigo pressing. Um, I've always really liked the way this album sounds. It has, and I mentioned it before, that it has a bit of a cinematic quality in some of the songs. Um, there's keyboards, there's percussion, there's a lot of things going on, but it doesn't get too crowded. Everything is very audible. It's spaced out really well, and I think with Tony Iommi produced it at Criteria Studios in Florida. And of course, sort of the backstory is that Tony was working pretty hard on the record while the other guys were like sunning themselves and laying by the
Mhm.
pool and stuff. But he did an amazing job, and I, I I love the album itself. I love the music on the album, but I love the way that it's produced. It has a just a very full sound, and they it's not the first time that Sabbath has incorporated different elements into the music, percussion, woodwind, orchestra strings, things like that. But I think Technical Ecstasy was where it became the most successful, and I think sounds the best. You could cite Sabbath Bloody Sabbath as having a lot of those type of outside the box things going on, but there's sometimes it's hard to hear some of the things, and overall, I've always thought that the master volume was really low, and because it's so low, it's hard to hear a lot of the things that are going on. It's mixed well, but I don't think the overall master on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath is as good as Technical Ecstasy. So the reason I picked Technical Ecstasy is I love the record, but I also love the way that there's a lot of use of ambitious an ambitious attempt to incorporate all these different elements, and it just sounds really good. It's a very successful production. So number three for me, Technical Ecstasy.
Yeah, good pick. If I were to pick Iommi's best guitar sound from the 70s, that album might do it for me. But I agree with you there. I'm glad you brought up that point about Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, because as I was getting ready for this today, I have an Apple TV thing hooked up to my TV, and I've got it hooked up to my stereo in my living room. So I was just kind of sitting there quickly jumping from one album to another, listening to a little bit here, a little bit there, because I kind of wanted to get a feel for how these albums sounded against each other. It's one thing when you're just listening to an album in isolation, but then when you're sort of jumping around and comparing it to other things. And I was kind of surprised, like Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, like you said, it sounds like it's quieter or something. It just doesn't have quite doesn't sound as large as, like you mentioned, Technical Ecstasy. So that's a good pick. Technical Ecstasy is not on my group of three. But what is at number three for me, Martin Birch, Mob Rules. Could have went with Heaven and Hell, but I kind of feel like Mob Rules has a little bit more meat on it sonically. There's nothing really tricky or there isn't any kind of slick studio production going on here. It's a pretty straightforward, sonically sounding record, but I just love the way the guitar sounds. This might be my favorite drum mix of all time. I'd have to think about it in relation to John Bonham, but the drum mix on here, Vinny Appice's drums sounds monstrous. I use that expression, throwing boulders. I think I stole it from Martin Popoff. Uh, Iommi sounds great. Geezer's bass on here might be what adds that little extra couple pounds of heaviness onto this
Yeah.
record because his bass is fat and distorted and loud in the mix, and it just gives everything like this sort of weight. Dio sounds great. Again, it's not a slick or overly produced record, but it just packs a punch. It's heavy, and it's heavy and just a very simple kind of. The guitars sound great, the bass sounds great, the drums sound great, the vocals sound great, even the E5150 and the more sort of atmospheric type of thing, Sign of the Southern Cross, the verse, and just the way all that stuff plays into it too. It's just maybe a master class in just getting the band to sound like the band. I don't think there's any trickery going on here. I don't think there's any Mutt Lang, Def Leppard tricks going on. It's just putting the mics in the right place and letting the band go for it. And I think it just totally works in here. Like I said, could have went with Heaven and Hell, but for me, Mob Rules just has that extra punch to it. So number three for me is Martin Birch and Mob Rules.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Heaven and Hell because it almost made my top three, but um, it's a little thin sounding. It's kind of a strange quality about it. I don't dislike the way that it sounds, but I think of the records that Martin Birch produced, I definitely think, uh, those being Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules, I definitely think he did a better job with Mob Rules. Mob Rules. I love the way this album sounds. You're right. I wouldn't consider it to be a slick production. There's nothing that sounds like it's enhanced in any unnatural way. But I just love the way that Martin Birch, I think it took him one album to kind of get his head wrapped around the Black Sabbath sound. And probably after Heaven and Hell was finished, maybe he had some time to think about it. And when the band came back and they started recording Mob Rules, he just like really dialed it in. I love the way every primary instrument sounds. I love the drums are huge. They're just monstrous. I love Geezer's bass. Tony's guitar, his tone is great. His solos, the way that they cut through the mix, sound great. His vocals are awesome. The keyboards are placed really well in the mix. They're very audible. They occupy their own space, but they're not overwhelming. They don't overshadow the guitar, the bass, or any other instrument. It's a perfect mix. I love the sound of the instruments, and to me, I've often said that Mob Rules is like my favorite. I think it's the best heavy metal album of all time, and I think that the production really is a big assist with that. I mean, the material, of course, is incredible. It's just a fantastic album, but I think the way that it's produced just makes it even that much better. It's just the perfect album, the way that it sounds, the music, everything. So, Mob Rules number two. It's a little bit higher for me, but yeah, I knew that was definitely going to make my list for sure.
Okay, this one might be a surprise. This album would rank towards the bottom of, if I'm ranking the Black Sabbath albums, which we've done here on Sabbath Sunday, this was towards the bottom of my list. But I've always liked the production on it, and that's Seventh Star. Jeff Glicksman.
Okay.
You may say the drums are a little bombastic and slightly dated, but I think they sound good. In for the Kill, the way that comes in. I think Iommi's guitar sounds great on this. It's got a real kind of sharpness to it. Now, this album doesn't have the heaviness of what you have from Mob Rules, but there's kind of a slickness to this, but a metallic. I don't know. I just love Iommi's guitar sound on this. I think the drums sound really good. The vocals sound great. The bass, although it doesn't sound like Geezer Butler style bass, it's still very audible. Uh, I don't know. This album is just has a clean sound to me, but it has a certain kind of punch to it that I just really like. I've just always liked the sound of this record, even though song wise, it doesn't crack my upper level, Sabbath albums. I've just always loved the sound of this, and I've always loved Iommi's guitar sound on this. Maybe because it was intended to be a solo album, they spent more time on the guitar on this or something.
Yeah.
But for the drums and the guitar, No Stranger to Love has a great, you may not like it because it's too poppy sounding, but from that perspective, it's a very well produced poppy song. Yeah, the drums sound a little maybe 80s in that one, but I don't know. There's this one I can't really put my finger on it. I've just always liked the production on this one.
Yeah, it's a good sounding production. It's a little typical of the '80s, but that's not a bad thing. It's to me, it sounds like a product of its time, and it sounds like an expensive production. Everything's very
Yeah.
audible. It suits the material, whereas with Mob Rules, it's a heavier album, and the way that it's produced, the way the instruments are EQ'd, some of the tones really enhance the music of that album. I don't think you could take a Mob Rules production and apply it to Seven
Hmm.
Star. I think it's produced the way that it should be. I think there's a different sensibility in the songwriting department. Of course, you have Glenn Hughes, who's a different kind of singer than Dio. He doesn't, go down in that low range, and he doesn't have. I mean, Glenn Hughes, of course, has a great voice, but I don't think he had, or at least he didn't utilize the same kind of range that Dio does on Mob Rules. And I'm just saying Mob Rules because I'm just comparing it to another '80s record, because this is the decade of, you can often tell when something was produced in the '80s.
Yeah.
There's good '80s and there's bad '80s, and I think this is kind of like straddling the fence, but I would say that it leans definitely more into the good '80s side of things. It's very audible. You tell it costs some money, and it definitely suits the material on the album. So yeah, that's a good pick. So for my number one, I'm gonna go with Master of
Wow.
Reality, the Vertigo version. Um, I love this album. It is my second favorite Black Sabbath album. And one of the reasons is I just think that this is at a point where the band started to become a little bit more confident in the studio, began to experiment with different things. We have some woodwind, Bill Ward's introducing some different percussion. I think there might even be double bass on it at some point. Um, but everything is rendered really, really well. It's a '70s style production, meaning it has kind of a flat tonality to it. Nothing is like over processed. It's pretty much a very organic record. But man, I just love Tony Iommi's guitar tone.
Hmm.
This is my favorite Tony Iommi guitar tone record, Master of Reality. I just love it. And I love the way that where it's leveled in the mix. It's in just the right spot. I also love Geezer's bass, and I've referenced this before when we got into our discussion about what is the quintessential Black Sabbath record. I said I just love the way that every instrument has its own, it occupies its own space. It has its own character. Iommi's guitar is very rich, it's heavy, and likewise, Geezer's bass has a really cool tone. It's a little on the higher end, I think, but it sort of has to be in order for it to cut through the mix. But the way that it blends with the guitar, I think, is perfect. And I love that I can hear the bass, that the bass is
Hmm.
so audible. I really appreciate that. So the primary instruments, we have guitar, drums, and bass. They're all on their own, in their own space, and very audible. You can hear everything that Bill's doing. Bill's drums overall sound better. I don't think it's Bill's best drum production, but I think it's better than the previous two albums where he whatever kit he was playing it, like he had like some his rack tom was sort of wonky. It was like he had like maybe a 12-inch rack tom and then a 16-inch floor tom. And when he would fill around the kit, you would hear the difference in tonality. There wasn't
Mm,
like a more of a smooth transition from one tom to the next. There was like this wonky high pitched tom that I was his rack tom, and I'm not sure exactly what it was, but I would say it was probably a 12-inch. But on this, it sounds like Bill's drums are deeper. He's playing with a different kit. His bass drums are thicker. They're boomier. There's a more of like a rounded sound to his drums. So all the instruments I appreciate. Of course, I love the album. There's some of Sabbath's best songs. There's some production things that are going on here. The beginning of After Forever, where it has like the backwards symbol,
mhm.
that's pretty cool. So you could tell that they're experimenting, with some studio tricks and things like that, but not to the point where it overshadows or it gets too distracting from the music. It's all about the music. It's all about the way the instruments sound, and it just works. It all blends together perfectly. So, my favorite sounding Black Sabbath album is Master of Reality, and it was produced by Roger Bain. It'd be we mentioned Martin Birch on
Mob rules.
Mob Rules. We mentioned Tony Iommi producing Technical Ecstasy. This is Roger Bain and Tom Allen. Was Tom Allen? I don't have the info right in front of me, but I think Roger Bain was the producer, and I think Tom Allen was the engineer on this. And Tom Allen should be a name familiar with most metalheads, as he produced "Screaming for Vengeance" and "Defenders of the Faith" by Judas Priest. So this is Tom Allen and a younger Tom Allen as a studio participant, but not as producer. So kind of interesting to note that too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I never really thought of this, but the way the guitar and the way the bass adds to the heaviness of Master of Reality, uh, I think of Into the Void, that do 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 do,
Yeah.
when the bass and the drums come in. Just man, the bass adds so much that it's some kind of similar to Mob Rules, like the way the bass is real heavy and distorted on Mob Rules. Trying to think, after Master of Reality, the bass kind of, at least during the Ozzy years, was never as loud and never as present from this point out. Maybe on Sabotage. You could say that on Sabotage, the bass is pretty, I think like Hole in the Sky, it's really distorted and right
Yeah.
there. But man, oh man, like on Master of Reality and on Mob Rules. For those people that might be interested, the YouTube channel Rick Beato, he's a name that probably a lot of people recognize. He did a video where he tries to get the sound Into the Void, and boy, does he get close. And one of the things he mentions in it is how the bass is a really important part of the heaviness and the overall sound. When you just isolate the guitar by itself, it doesn't when you add the bass into it too, it just becomes this one big monstrous sound. So yeah, definitely a good, can't argue with Master of Reality. But my number one pick is going to be a Roger Bain, and for me, it's the first album. Maybe this is because of the atmosphere on this record. Ironic that they only spent like 2 days and 800 pounds or whatever to make this their quickest record that they would make. Uh, but there's just a certain atmosphere to it. There's this, I don't know if this is reverb that was added after the fact or if it was room reverb or I don't know what, but the song Black Sabbath, the atmosphere in that song, the instruments are all very there. The bass, the guitar, the drums. I mean, it sounds like you're sitting in the room with them. It's just sounds like you're sitting in a church with them. That's what it sounds like. They're playing in a church. You're sitting about 10 pews back from them. Uh, Behind the Wall of Sleep, Wicked World. I mean, just the whole thing. There's just NIB. I just love Iommi's guitar sound on this. I love the drum sound on this. It may be a little bright, but there's just this sort of, I don't know, the Wizard, the way the drums sound in
Hmm.
that.
Yep.
Gosh, just the whole record. There's just a real vibe and atmosphere to this album, and I, they barely spent any time doing it. So I think it was really just a simple case of just capturing them live. But if you hear those John Peel session recordings, they were on that Ozzy greatest hits thing that he put out, I think like in the 90s or 2000s, where they do Black Sabbath and they do War Pigs, and but some of the lyrics are different. The arrangement on Black Sabbath is a little bit different. And that's cool and everything, but that has a real kind of dry sound to it. But here, this production just adds this atmosphere to it that I don't know, man, it can't be beat. And I just absolutely love it. Call it catching magic in a bottle because they obviously didn't spend, they weren't sitting there twiddling knobs or something for weeks on end trying. And this is
Yeah.
always the argument that Ozzy made, like as time went on and they had more money and more time, he felt the more time they spent in the studio was to the detriment of the way the record would sound. And he always referenced back to the first record, like, hey, we just went in and in 2 days we knocked this out and it sounded phenomenal. And
Yeah.
maybe Blizzard of
Yeah.
Oz has a little bit of that vibe to it too, like not overthinking it, just kind of going in, setting the microphones up and going for it. But there's just something about the production on this record that I just think is really, really special. I think other bands have tried to capture this. Maybe Candlemass's Epicus, Doomicus, Metallicus comes closest to capturing this vibe. But yeah, there's just some secret magic thing going on in this record.
Yeah.
A moment in time, just captured. So number
Yeah,
one
you're
for
right.
me,
It's
self-titled.
a good pick. Yeah, it's got a lot of atmosphere. It does have a vibe. Um, it kind of brings you. It's one of those records where you listen to it, and we've talked about this before. Uh, the atmosphere of the record is just really huge. Um, and I'm sure it's by accident. I don't think there was that much thought or even that much of a budget to try to think of it in terms of some kind of conceptual, you know, sound
Yeah,
concept.
yeah.
It just worked out that way. And it really suits the material well, especially on Black Sabbath, where it's the atmosphere, it's the sound between the tom hits, it's like
Hmm.
it's that the sparseness of the song Black Sabbath, and it's what you're hearing when the instruments aren't playing between the notes. That's also part of the song. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh,
So
yeah.
yeah, it has just a great atmosphere. But this is the part where I say, if you like the Warner Brothers version, you have to listen to the Vertigo version because it has everything going on that's in the Warner Brothers, except there's a lot more clarity, there's a lot more detail. And I know when I have, the headphones on, or if I just have it at the right volume, the volume is the sweet spot, it actually sounds like the band is in the room. You could just hear everything. It still has the atmosphere, but where I think the Warner Brothers master, of course, for people that don't know, there's two different masters. There's the US master and then there's the UK master. Um, the US master obviously is Warner Brothers, and it's just a little bit murky. It's a little bit muffled in comparison to the UK Vertigo master, which, like I said, it's a lot more clarity, it's a lot more detail. So of the two, I lean personally more towards the Vertigo, but some people like that kind of murky quality or the slightly bassier tone of the Warner Brothers. It's a subjective call, but um, I encourage everybody to try to find an original UK Vertigo. And I think if you can, and they're pretty expensive, but I think the closest you can get to, for my ears, would be the 2011 Rhino. I think it's Kevin Gray,
Right.
master of the first three or four albums. sound really close to the UK Vertigo, and there's very little difference to my ears between that 2011 uh, Rhino and the original UK Vertigo. So if you can't get the original UK Vertigo, check out the 2011 Rhino version, not to be confused with the 2016, which were the double albums with the bonus tracks. Those don't, I don't really care for those too much, but the earlier versions of the Rhino reissues are really, really good. In fact, at this point, they might almost be as expensive as the original Vertigo pressings, because I mean, I've seen a couple of them going for like $200,
Wow.
and that's, I mean, I don't know, if you get a really clean copy of a UK Vertigo, Black Sabbath, Paranoid. Well, Paranoid is a whole different thing, because Paranoid, we get into like the production credits on the inside, the Big Bear line.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you're going to pay big bucks for that. That's the first pressing. But um, moving from there on to Master of Reality, it's a bit of a difference. I'm not sure it's as profound between the US and the UK Vertigo version of Master Reality. Um, Volume 4, though, is probably the most noticeable, with the George Peckman Master versus the US Warner Brothers. It's definitely noticeable. There's a lot of things, a lot more detail in the UK Master, that I think makes it more enjoyable to me. I mean, of course, the first version I ever got was when I was a kid. I got the Warner Brothers version, and it sounded just fine to my ears. But then after I heard so much about the master, the UK master, the Vertigo, and I was a little bit older, I tracked it down and I got it. And sure enough, it definitely sounded better. So now it's pretty much the only one I can listen to. After that, there really wasn't any difference. So we're going Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, the WWA version versus the Warner Brothers. Really wasn't any difference. Same thing with Sabotage. The first pressing was on NEMS versus the Warner Brothers US. I think they were both mastered in Sterling Sound in California, so there's hardly any difference. But those first four albums, like if you're an audiophile or whatever, you're a Sabbath completist, definitely encourage everybody to check out both masters, the US and the UK, and compare them. Um,
There you go.
Definitely a noticeable sound difference.
All right. Well, there you go. There's our three picks for the best produced, the best sonically sounding records to our ears. Let us know what you think of our picks. Let us know what your picks would be for your favorite sounding produced Black Sabbath records. Let us know in the comments down below. Make sure you check out our podcast, and we will see you at the next Sabbath Sunday.